all of a sudden, everything changed. Denise Boggs has revealed the truth about Joni Lamb in a startling revelation. Furthermore, it's not at all what Daystar watchers had anticipated. Long-suspected tensions, surprising confessions, and hidden details are finally being revealed. Silence, image, and allegiance hid the truth for years. However, it is no longer the case. Denise simply drew back the curtain, and what she revealed may rock Daystar's whole foundation and everyone who relied on it. Everything about Marcus Lamb's words had weighed in those last days as he lay in his hospital bed. He was not in a panic. He was not perplexed. He was intent. Marcus, a devout man and the founder of Daystar, was aware that his time was limited. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing content. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Now, back to the topic. What we were talking about was. More significantly, though, he was aware of what he wished to abandon. And it wasn't fame, fortune, or a well-groomed appearance. It was guidance. It was a legacy. He requested Denise Boggs. Denise was more than just a counselor to many. Marcus trusted her with the most private information that no one else ever heard. Roughly. Therefore, it wasn't a casual request when he asked his daughter Rachel to call Denise from his hospital room. It was urgent. It was deliberate. Marcus spoke to Denise directly when the connection connected, and his words would reverberate well beyond that room. He instructed her to put everything in writing. Then, not later. This was not a man who was having a hard time hanging on. This boss was ensuring that his last directives were noted and recalled. Marcus' statements, according to Denise, were neither ambiguous or motivated by emotion. They were purposeful, methodical, and well-organized. He wasn't thinking back. He was outlining a strategy. He was straightforward with her. Because he thought the moment had come to give Daystar to the following generation. And more than just a generic notion, Marcus had specific people and positions in mind. His son Jonathan Lamb was to take over as the main leader, and Marcus identified him as the first Lamb who did so. Joni and I built Daystar, but we built it so the children could carry it on, he said. Needed to take the mantle, but Jonathan wouldn't be doing it alone. Marcus considered his wife Susie to be an important partner, someone who could provide him with emotional and spiritual support. He didn't stop there, though, as his daughters Rachel and Rebecca, along with Rebecca's husband J.W., were each assigned distinct roles in the future leadership. However, one individual was absent from that vision, Rachel's husband, Joshua Brown. Joshua was actively involved in Daystar's operations at the time, so his absence from Marcus' plan was apparent. Denise claimed she had a feeling it was deliberate, even though Marcus declined to provide an explanation. She respected the boundary and didn't press him. What mattered? The last thing Marcus said to her was, "You make sure it gets where it needs to go." Denise followed his instructions, and she shared them with Joni Lamb and other important family members. She said there was no ambiguity, no confusion, and Marcus wasn't babbling in his last hours. Instead, he was giving the keys to the kingdom with accuracy. He wanted unity and faith to lead the transition, not for Daystar to become disorganized or split by power struggles. However, what happened next would rock everything. Rather than the smooth transition Marcus had hoped for, Joni Lamb took complete control. Denise watched as the very vision Marcus had fought to put in place started to fall apart, and that's what makes this so painful. Jonathan, the man Marcus had privately prepared for leadership and publicly prayed over, was removed. He was allegedly pushed out under pressure, spiritual abuse, and silence. Denise has clung to that call like sacred ground because, to her, Marcus' words weren't just instructions, they were a final act of love for his family, for his ministry. This was a direct message from a man who knew his time was running out and wanted his legacy to continue through his children. However, as the dust settles and stories emerge, one can't help but wonder, how could something so clear be so easily ignored? And, perhaps ultimately, they were also a warning. Marcus Lamb was a visionary, not just a preacher or businessman, and long before he ever lay in a hospital bed, he was already considering the future, not just the future of his family, but the future of Daystar, the international Christian television network he and his wife Joni had founded from the ground up. Over the years, Marcus did more than just lead Daystar. He watched, prayed, and listened, paying attention to how his children carried themselves not only on camera but also in private, in prayer, in meetings, and in the quiet moments that go unnoticed. Marcus recognized that legacy only matters if you prepare for it. To him, this wasn't about selecting a successor based on who was the most polished or well-liked. It was about spiritual calling, being in line with God's purpose, which is why he had already made up his mind when the time came. Marcus explained everything to Denise Boggs during that last meaningful call without hesitation, and his son Jonathan Lamb would lead, not just because he was family. Instead, Marcus made the firm decision, based on years of spiritual preparation, that Jonathan was the first lamb who needed to step in because he firmly believed that Jonathan had been called by God to carry the vision forward. He didn't use poetic language or gentle suggestions. Instead, he stated it bluntly: Jonathan is the first lamb who needs to step in. He envisioned Jonathan's wife, Susie, not only as a supporting figure but as a co-laborer, someone who would be standing beside him, shoulder to shoulder, helping carry the weight of spiritual and organizational responsibility. He understood that running a ministry like Daystar requires more than one person, so he described an entire structure, a family system of leadership designed to keep the ministry in line with its mission. Marcus' daughters, Rachel and Rebecca, weren't left out. Marcus wanted Daystar to stay in the hands of people who loved the ministry and understood the weight of its calling. To him, this wasn't about power, but rather about stewardship. He gave them clear roles and recognized their strengths, and in a very deliberate move, he also included Rebecca's husband, J.W., in this new vision. However, Denise Boggs noticed something. Joshua Brown, Rachel's husband, was surprisingly absent from the entire conversation as she listened to Marcus speak. At the time, Joshua was actively involved in Daystar's operations, so on paper, it would have made sense for his name to be included because he was already a member of the family and had a public-facing role in the network. However, Denise immediately noticed that Marcus never once mentioned him. She wanted to ask why, but something in Marcus' tone told her that now was not the time to inquire or probe further. Whatever the reason, Marcus had obviously made up her mind, and Denise respected that silence. The remainder of the conversation proceeded with clarity and purpose, and Marcus instructed Denise to make sure that everything he said was understood. He made it clear that these weren't just thoughts, but instructions. He explained that a mission is loud, not because it was said, but because it wasn't. He gave her marching orders, saying, "You make sure it gets where it needs to go." Denise took that seriously, and she conveyed Marcus' message to the people he had trusted the most: Joni, his kids, and Daystar's leadership. From then on, the expectations were straightforward: respect his wishes, follow the plan, let the kids lead. But that's not what happened. Instead of seeing his meticulously planned strategy come to fruition, the public witnessed something completely different. Jonathan was fired, let go, and not reassigned. Marcus had prepared, prayed over, and selected the man who would lead the organization, and Susie was also removed. What had been presented as a seamless transition now appeared to be a complete denial of Marcus' final request, and this is where things became even more murky. Insiders and family members claimed that Jonathan's departure had not been amicable, claiming that he was subjected to spiritual pressure, manipulation, and even surveillance. It seemed as though Marcus' voice had been erased, and his plan had been replaced by something completely different. Those who still believed in Marcus' vision began calling the people behind the scenes, the ones opposing Jonathan's leadership, the Daystar Mafia, a group defined not by familial ties but by control and secrecy. Denise was devastated, not only because the plan had failed, but also because. But the most concerning thing is that no one in leadership ever publicly discussed Marcus' plan because his intentions had been so pure, so prayerful, and so full of purpose. He didn't establish a hierarchy to appease people or play favorites. Instead, he created a spiritual blueprint to safeguard the mission, and now that blueprint was being disregarded. There was no open discussion, no family round, no public statement, and only silence under Joni Lamb, who had taken over the network. With that silence came increasing suspicion, increasing frustration, and increasing division. For many viewers who had followed Daystar for decades, this was more than just a family issue. It was a test of integrity, and people donated to this ministry because they thought it was guided by faith, openness, and the gospel's tenets. Now, those same individuals were witnessing a profoundly spiritual moment as a father's final request was subtly denied without justification. What about Joshua Brown? His exclusion is still one of the story's greatest mysteries. Did Marcus notice something that others missed? We don't know, but we do know that Marcus had a plan, that it was planned and intelligent, and that it was ignored. That silence is still reverberating, and the real question now is, will someone break it? Was there a deeper problem, a conflict that he didn't want to talk about? Marcus Lamb left behind more than just a television empire when he died. He left behind a vision, a ministry, and a spiritual legacy that had impacted millions of people worldwide. Daystar had been a lighthouse for Christian viewers seeking truth, healing, and hope for decades, and throughout that time, Marcus had been a dependable leader who was devoted to his calling and made it his life's work to use media to spread the gospel. But what was initially appearing to be a quiet transfer of that legacy, things swiftly took a completely different turn. The family grieved, tributes poured in, and his wife and longtime ministry partner, Joni Lamb, publicly took over as Daystar's new face, speaking about Marcus' vision, his passion for the ministry, and the significance of continuing with strength and unity. At the time of Marcus's death, the power dynamics within Daystar changed quickly, and instead of following the spiritual succession plan Marcus had so clearly outlined to Denise Boggs, naming his son Jonathan as the next leader, things took a drastic turn. To viewers, this may have appeared to be a logical continuation, simply the next chapter in a story of faith, but behind the scenes, a very different story was taking place. Within a few months, Jonathan and his wife Susie were quietly removed from leadership. There was no formal announcement of the change, no family discussion, no public explanation, just silence. It was not only disappointing, but also confusing, and to those who had known Marcus well, it felt like betrayal because Marcus hadn't just hinted at Jonathan's departure. Joni Lamb didn't just step in temporarily, she took full control. Future role. He had made it his last goal to make sure his son would continue the work, and now that son was gone. The staff inside the Daystar building was divided and perplexed. Some had always admired Jonathan's quiet strength and humble nature, and they trusted the way he led, gentle, prayerful, and not ostentatious, while others were more devoted to Joni, who had been with the network from the beginning and had a strong public presence. What had started out as a cohesive workplace started to feel more like a battlefield of allegiances as people took sides, whispers became rumors, tension pervaded the air, and then the unexpected term, Daystar Mafia, was coined by some insiders and former workers to describe the group of people. It sounded dramatic, but the stories behind it were real: reports of control, surveillance, and intimidation, accusations of spiritual pressure and manipulation, and a struggle for control over the future of the entire ministry. These were the people around Joni, those thought to be influencing decisions, protecting power, and silencing opposition. This gradual disintegration was initially invisible to those outside the ministry. Daystar continued to broadcast its shows, the cameras continued to roll, sermons were delivered, and music was played, but behind that smooth facade, a storm was brewing, and supporters who had followed the ministry for years started to notice something was wrong. Longtime donors became uneasy, viewers began to ask questions, and some withdrew their donations entirely. Denise Boggs, who had carried Marcus' last words like sacred instructions, initially tried to remain silent, but as she watched the plan being dismantled piece by piece, she found it impossible to remain silent because she knew what Marcus had said and had heard it with. Her testimony was a turning point for some, confirming what many had already suspected, that Daystar was no longer being guided by the spiritual compass Marcus had provided. She felt it was her duty to speak out, so she did, sharing the details of her last phone conversation with Marcus, describing how specific and clear his vision had been, and revealing how far things had veered off course. Joni Lamb, the face of the ministry, the host of Joni Table Talk, and a symbol of tenacity, was at the center of it all. Many had long viewed Joni as a pillar of strength, particularly after Marcus' death, but now her leadership was being questioned. Why had she turned down Marcus' plan? Why was Jonathan? Joni gave few answers, denying the rumors, defending the changes as necessary and in Daystar's best interests when she spoke in public, but the silence surrounding Marcus' wishes only heightened the questions. Why was the ministry acting more like a business empire than a spiritual family? Jonathan and Susie, on the other hand, took a different route. They didn't respond in the media, they didn't do interviews or level accusations, they just vanished from the story and the screen, but their absence spoke louder than words could. Marcus's trusted leaders were removed from the future he had meticulously planned, what had started as a ministry based on prayer, humility, and Marcus' spiritual legacy, the cornerstone of Daystar, was eroding behind a curtain of power politics. The sad thing is that this wasn't just a family dispute, it wasn't just about leadership or business, it was about faith, it was about the message being preached versus the actions being taken. Mission now appeared to be stuck in a struggle for image, influence, and control. The story of Daystar has now evolved beyond a church scandal to become a mirror held up to any ministry that grows too big too quickly and forgets the truth. Behind the scenes, it caused a painful kind of spiritual confusion for many viewers and supporters. How could a ministry built on truth ignore the truth? How could a network that preached obedience to God so easily dismiss the dying wishes of the man who built it? There is still a power struggle, but the legacy is still up for grabs. Despite all the reports, the leaked calls, and Denise Boggs' emotional revelations, something still doesn't sit right for those who have followed Daystar. And for those who are still watching, those who once firmly believed in what Daystar stood for, the question is no longer what happened, but rather whether it can be redeemed. The biggest question that everyone keeps returning to is why Marcus Lamb's final wishes were not fulfilled. For years, people who once had a strong belief in its mission are still left with questions that no one seems willing to answer. These questions haven't diminished, on the contrary, they've only gotten louder, more urgent, and more unsettling because this isn't just about a ministry, it's about trust, integrity, and whether people of faith are being told the truth. Ignored? He made it clear, as several witnesses attest to. From his hospital bed, he addressed Denise Boggs directly, outlining a very detailed, well-thought-out plan for Daystar's future, in which Jonathan Lamb was to take the lead, his sisters Rachel and Rebecca had their roles, and their spouses had been listed, with one name missing. Some have attempted to justify it by claiming that Marcus wasn't in his right mind, that he was ill, or that perhaps Joni knew better, but Denise firmly disputed that notion, arguing that Marcus was lucid, purposeful, and intensely focused. In other words, it wasn't ambiguous or sentimental, rather, it was structured and purposeful. Then comes the next question: what actually happened to Jonathan and Susie? Their firing was not made public, and there was never a complete explanation. All that is known is that they are no longer with us. It wasn't a ramble, it was a father's last mission. If Joni Lamb truly believed in honoring her husband's legacy, why didn't she honor the one thing he asked for most? Quietly removed. No statements, no interviews, just silence. Some claim they were forced out, while others say they chose to leave. What is certain is that they have been removed from Marcus's portrayal. If their decision was genuinely based on strategy and wisdom, why not be open and honest about it? The silence itself has turned suspicious. Trust-based ministries shouldn't have to conceal decisions behind closed doors and locked meetings. When people donate their time, money, and faith to a ministry, they should be honest. Failure to do so creates space for something much worse: doubt. Another unanswerable question concerns Joni Lamb, who was once praised as a devoted wife, TV host, and she is now at the center of what seems like a spiritual and organizational storm, and her image has drastically changed. Why hasn't she addressed Denise's claims directly? Why didn't she speak out about Marcus' succession plan? Was she defending the ministry or power? And who are the people behind the scenes giving her advice? The rumors about a Daystar. If so many former employees have subtly confirmed stories of intimidation and manipulation, it's difficult to ignore the conspiracy theory that the mafia, a small group of insiders allegedly controlling decisions and suppressing dissident, is real. Is the leadership of Daystar more about loyalty than calling? And then there's the money. Daystar has long been dependent on donations from devoted viewers who give selflessly, sometimes even beyond their means, and who felt they were supporting ministry rather than luxury. As a result, they felt deceived when they discovered the private jet, the extravagant spending, and the mysterious finances, which raises another straightforward but impactful question. In what location did the money